everybody, I'm Jooste. I'm so glad you've joined us for this session, COVID-19 Science Scandal Solutions. Really very few stories, I don't have data on this, but very few stories in the past year have not been about COVID-19 in some way or another. This session is about unpacking the various approaches that have made up the full package of COVID-related stories. It has many facets. Of course, it has science, and many journalists around the world have had to grapple with the science and become accustomed to some of the jargon and some of the questions and ways of approaching science. Unfortunately, very quickly, it became clear to us that it is also a follow the money story. Budgets were made available around the world. Procurement related to PPE and all other areas of life really meant that journalists who are skilled in following the money had a big story to follow. So we have somebody who has followed a really big story in South Africa, the digital vibe scandal, who will talk to us about that. And also, I mean, you know, the science itself, the scandal aspect, those are all problems, and human beings want solutions. So we're also going to look at the solutions journalism approach to telling the COVID-19 story. And so here to tell us more about each of their approaches and for you to ask questions of our top global science journalist, Adele Baleta. She's also a pandemic mentor at Internews. And then also Peter Louis Myburgh, who is with Scorpio, Daily Maverick, who's brought us that digital vibe scandal in all its unfolding, as I've said. And we also have Chidera Rose Camille Aneke from Abuja in Nigeria, who reports for Darling FM. And her approach is to listen to the questions that people have, listen to the solutions that people are yearning for. And so she'll tell us more about that. So I think let's dive right in and go to you, Adele. Thank you very much. Let me just kick off and say, I've heard lots of people talk about, you know, the science is complex. Well, let's just investigate it. What would be your take on that? Or would you like to take us first through what you've prepared to kind of prepare the scene? Up to you.
Thank you so much, Ida, and it's a great pleasure to be here, and thanks to AIJC. So yes, I'm going to look at science, okay, the part of COVID-19 that is the science. And we can look at how do we interrogate the science? Is it appropriate to interrogate the science if we don't actually know what the science is saying and if we don't understand science? I think this is very critical in a health emergency like the COVID-19 pandemic. But in addition to that, there's going to be tips about science in general. So let's move on. So responding to the COVID-19 crisis, we really have a responsibility to disseminate credible information. And I think that a highlight of this, as we've been seeing, is the effect of misconception, conspiracy theories, that this has had on, say, for example, vaccine hesitancy, where the public have been completely and utterly confused. So what are the issues here? First of all, there's been a lack of capacity, which means that all journalists have had to step up to the plate. So non-science journalists, non-health journalists, political journalists, through no fault of their own, of course, have had to actually delve into this issue. But a lack of knowledge is definitely there, and there's not much science literacy, I would say, and I would argue, never mind amongst journalists, I think amongst the public, and I think Africa-wide. So what we've been seeing is instant experts coming into the field who presume to be able to interrogate the science. And that has led to major issues and major problems out in the field, and lack of actually information that people can use with good faith. So there's also the issue about confirmation bias. How many stories do we write that confirm our bias? So we're not looking at the facts. We're just looking for those stories that we think are saying what we believe, but are they actual factual stories? That's very important. Of course, this fuels rumors, misconceptions, and misinformation. I argue very strongly that there's a dire need for training, whether there be workshops on Zoom, webinars, online courses. I really do think that we need to step up science literacy in Africa in general, because there are going to be more pathogens and there are going to be more health crises. Okay, so there's a lot of information out there. We all know that. We've all been struggling with it. How do we make sense of it all? Not only for ourselves, but also for the general public. Of course, not all science is good or useful. Not all research is good or useful. But the question is, how do we evaluate that? And how do you evaluate that for the public? You need some knowledge, some science knowledge to be able to do that. You know, do we believe one expert over another? Who's actually telling us the truth? And of course, as Ida already mentioned, there's the unhelpful jargon. So moving on, the interesting thing, okay, is that if you look at what scientists' skills, their skills base, they are actually very similar to our skills base. So it's not just about the facts. They've got to ask the right questions. They've got to think systematically. And this really is about the scientific method. If we as journalists don't understand the scientific method, we don't really understand what their script is, what they are trying to do. We need to make the right decisions based on critical evaluation. Need to make the right decisions based on the evidence. And they also want to solve a wide range of problems. I mean, science and society, the impact of science and society is enormous. Just look around you right now and think about what discovery led to the computer, the light above you, etc. It's science and technology. They have to have good computer skills, and they also have to develop effective communication skills. It's becoming very important, more so now than ever, as we have seen a lot of scientists have stepped up to this public space and actually had to explain their science for the benefit of everybody. Journalist skills, it's asking the best questions. We have to cross-check our information. We also have to critically evaluate information. We have to plan and write stories that have logical flow. This is our script, okay? We don't just plump information onto a page or broadcast. We have to think about it and we have to have a plan. So we also want to solve problems for readers. We work to deadlines, but we do want to give accurate, accessible, and credible information. That is if we want to remain in the field of journalism. Okay, so they have similar goals. Both scientists and journalists are seeking the truth and they want to make it known. They have the public interest in common. Definitely, we try to guard against being misled. We put a tremendous amount of energy into that, all right? And Peter Louis, I'm sure, and Chidera will speak to that as well. We are required to verify information. We have sub-editors, we've got chief sub-editors and so on. We go through a process of peer review, as do they. We also insist that society allow us freedom, as well as the scientists, to pursue our investigations wherever they lead. And we also work by debate and controversy. So there's a lot in common. So, you know, this kind of notion that we are a force separate from scientists merely because we don't understand them is actually a bit of a fallacy. And that's one way of feeling good about getting in there and understanding science more closely. What about fraud? So scientific fraud is really, there is pseudoscience. We've had tremendous amount of examples about that. This is aside from following the money, okay? Aside from investigating is in our usual norm of work. I'm talking about scientific fraud, okay? To be able to detect what's going on, to be able to be the bloodhound, you have to know a field of research, because that's how you know how to ask the right questions. You need to check up on the scientists. Are these scientists credible scientists? What organization do they belong to? What other papers have they published? Are they published in peer-reviewed journals? And some journalists have been absolutely phenomenal at investigating scientists themselves, which has actually led to scientists being pushed out of top jobs in top institutions because of the solid work of journalism, but with scientific understanding and knowledge. All right, so we need to ask about the numbers, we need to ask about the scientists, we need to be wary of claims are made in a public statement. You have to always, if you are unsure, you need to go to another expert in the field. So if it's a paper on immunology, you go to another immunologist and say, I'm not understanding this, can you help me with this? Help me go through the science. So there's every single way in which you can actually approach this, okay? You need to check for the various approvals, you need to be sure of the facts, and of course, you need to be you need to be available for accurate, accessible, and credible information. There's a great distinction, and a lot of people don't know this, between textbook versus frontier science. And a lot of the COVID-19 science has been about frontier science. So textbook science is consensus science. It is that settled scientific knowledge on which new work can be built. You know, CO2 is carbon, one carbon molecule and two oxygen molecules, for example. So that is science that everybody knows, we understand it, but there needs more work will be built on that. However, frontier science is the science that is happening now as it's being conducted. Its results have just been obtained and they are uncertain and unconfirmed because scientific done, all right? There are lots of studies that are being done at the same time so that there is a body of knowledge that develops over time about what really does amount to the actual facts of science. So one day coffee is good for you, the next day it's bad for you. One day you can have 1 glass of wine, the next day it's 3 glasses of wine. You know, it's kind of confusing. But if you actually understand that the science is evolving, and I'll come to that later, then you'll know how to frame it. Very important. Here is an example of how to frame it. And I love this. This comes from Dr. Anthony Fauci, who we've known. He's been on air ad nauseum in newspapers and so on and so forth. So he had this whole issue around masks, no masks. He got into trouble. This was his response. The people who are giving the ad hominems are saying, oh, Fauci misled us. First he said no masks, then he said masks. Well, let me give you a flash, he says. Now, let me just find my flash here. Yes. That is the way science works. You work with the data at the time. It is essential as a scientist that you evolve your opinion and your recommendations based on the data as it evolves. That is a self-correcting process. And that is the reason why I say people who then criticize me about that are actually criticizing science. It was not a change because I felt like flip-flopping. It was a change because the evidence changed, the data changed. Now, that is what I think a lot of our journalists are not understanding. Then, you know, it's like, why are these scientists saying one thing one day and one the next day? Because that is the way that science works. And if you don't understand that, you're not going to be able to put that across to your audiences in the accurate way that it should be. So what is science? An example of the evolving science. There are new emerging variants, the duration of immunity. There's the potential for transmission post-vaccination, the need for annual vaccination or booster doses. This is still unsettled. We don't know yet. And you know, journalists, we love to have a yes and no answer. Just scientists, please just tell me what it is. It doesn't work like that in science. How long masks will be necessary, for example, the impact of vaccination on daily activities. So there's this issue around uncertainty, and we need to really get to grips with that as journalists. To understand it's an essential part of scientific discovery. We need to acknowledge that. We need to actually put that into this public sphere where we're saying that science cannot be certain until the replication studies have done, until enough studies have been done, until studies have been refuted, for example. And scientists can disagree. It's very important that they do. It's fundamental that they do, because that is what drives discovery. Again, it's the way you frame the uncertainty in the public space. The other very important thing that I want to talk about here is the issue around false balance. It's very important because I think many journalists don't really have a handle on this, and I see that it often comes out in various ways, and I'll give an example. We as journalists are often taught to be objective, all right? I mean, secretly, I think we all know that that is a little strange, that there's no such thing really as objectivity. We often have agendas. It depends on who our organizations are owned by. This is an important thing to note. Obviously, we want to try and be as objective as possible. In science, there is no real balance, okay? Because it doesn't mean giving equal weight to both sides of an argument. In science, we say that the evidence is heavier than the wishful thinking, and therefore science needs to be given max audience, as opposed to, for example, pseudoscientists, people that are vaccine denialists, all right? This is vitally important. So you give the weight according to the balance of the evidence. Now, I've noted, okay, that there are a number of scientists who are unwilling to be interviewed. They do not want to be interviewed next to vaccine denialists, pseudoscientists. They're not interested in that balance. And there's a story that I have, in fact, with a particular scientist who actually refused an interview on that basis, because there was going to be equal weighting given to the vaccine denialist and to him. And he's a top immunologist, world famous immunologist. And I tend to agree with that. So the advice, okay, or if I can suggest, is that if you, because the story requires within a community, for example, that there are myths, rumors, and conspiracies, you need to give much more weight, which means more time, to the scientist, because the scientist's message needs to come through the fastest. That scientist needs to be able to stand there and to debunk the denialists and the pseudoscientists. Otherwise, I strongly suggest that you are doing the community a disservice. We see lots of people not wanting to be vaccinated, for example. So that's really me. I also think that if I've got a few seconds, I think that it's really important. I have a checklist here. When you're doing the science, again, please, you cannot presume to interrogate the science. You can interrogate the scientist. You can look for the pseudoscientist, but when it comes to the science, when it comes to studies, if you do not understand it, then you really need to get training and you need to do more reading if that is what you want to be doing. You know, I would suggest, okay, is that I don't think that there is politics. There is politics in science, but science is not politics. There's a very different thing there that's going on, okay? And the two cannot be equated. So say, for example, I'm just using that as an example. If you're a political journalist, then I think you want to be wary about interrogating science if you don't actually know what the scientific principles are. So just very briefly, those of you who are doing the science, okay, who are looking at the studies, all right, you really want to do a checklist before submitting your story. You want to know, is this an initial finding? If it's still investigations are continuing, then you need to say that, okay? What was the primary finding? Who was involved? Who does it affect? Where did it take place, the actual study? Why does it matter? Why now? Right? How was this research conducted? Was there anything special about this? Were there any limitations? Where does this all sit in the bigger picture? Okay. Have you spoken to a range of people, including non-experts? And more importantly, have you gone beyond the press release? You know, really? A lot of people that write press releases are not the scientists. Press releases cannot be just copied and plonked in. It is too dangerous with science journalism, and I would argue with any kind of journalism. You need to think about all the angles. You need to think about where there are conflicts of interest. Where was the work funded, for example? That's vital, okay? Is there confirmation bias? Have you reported responsibly? And you really need to give an accurate depiction of the findings. So again, very important, check yourself. Check your confirmation bias. Do you understand issues around balance and false balance? Other important things. Do you know that area of research well? I would find it very difficult to put out a story where I was insecure about what the actual content of the study is. At the moment, my final word is that there's a lot of scientific information that is out there. There are a lot of things that are happening in science as well. There are a lot of preprints that are going out there that are being retracted, okay? So science is not perfect either. Science makes mistakes. Even the top journals are retracting papers. So just step warily. Thank you very much, Ida. Back to you.
Thanks, Adele, for that. I mean, you've just reminded us how complex it has been, actually, even for scientists and especially for journalists new to this field. And just imagine how complex to the millions of people out there in the world who've suddenly had to deal with the story, the misinformation, and of course, COVID-19 in their lives. Chidera, you listen to those questions and concerns that people have. And I'd love for you to take us through the approach of solutions journalism and the kinds of stories that have come out of, following that approach as you do. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Ida. Thank you, Adele. You also pointed out very important things. So I'd like to start from this very personal experience. It's interesting how conversations with the people close to us can give us just a pulse of what many other people in our communities think or feel about a novel disease like COVID-19 or innovations in health like the COVID-19 vaccines. And for me personally, it was my mother. The moment breakthroughs were announced that we have COVID-19 vaccines, she sent me an SMS. Chidera, no matter what happens, do not take the vaccine. Be among the last people to take the vaccine with a gun held to your head. That's the only time you will take the vaccine. I was shocked, but I responded with a why, mom? And she said, oh, our immunity is strong. We have the sun here. in Africa to protect us. We have the sun in Nigeria. So we had a series of back and forth. And I had to eventually resign to OK Mom because I knew that I needed the facts in order to, make her believe that COVID-19 vaccines work. At that point as well, I knew that I needed to understand how COVID-19 vaccines work to better explain to my mother, the people around me, and my listeners. As journalists, we have the responsibility of knowing. We have to know. And I'm glad Adele mentioned that in our presentation. We need to understand how these things work in order to tell the stories properly. Stories from the adverse events following immunization, which people have amplified, and talk about it as if it is the COVID-19 vaccine causing people certain symptoms. But anyways, I'm going to be sharing solution approaches towards covering COVID-19. I'm going to be sharing my personal approaches, the way I was able to do it using solutions. There's an entire session on solutions journalism, which will be on Wednesday with Runa Mayers and her team. So I'm going to share the basics. I'll start with the 5 W's and the H. What, where, when, why, who, and how. What is this solution approach that I talk about? What is solution? So from the way I like to look at it, solution stories investigate and explain how people try to solve problems that are widely shared, like COVID-19. All the world were battling COVID-19 at that point. So it's a widely shared problem. So focusing on what people in different areas, different communities, different countries are doing to solve certain problems around COVID-19, how they did it, and what evidence even shows that it worked, and what didn't work about it, and why it didn't work. It mustn't be cheesy. Solutions journalism isn't just about reporting, this worked, it worked and worked. Even if it didn't work, reporting it also is solutions journalism. So where can this happen? Where can one practice solutions journalism? At what point can one tell stories from the solutions approach, using the solutions approach? It's everywhere. Everywhere people are solving issues around COVID-19. It could be in your community, it could be in your locality. It could just be from listening to people. You find out where people are handling things differently, and then you share their stories. When should we tell stories around COVID-19 from the solutions approach? The time is now. Now, when we have several issues concerning COVID-19 and COVID-19 vaccines, from COVID corruption to misinformation, there's just so many problems around COVID. And if we keep focusing on that, it might just be us complaining. So the time is now. The solution approach can be explored. Why is it important? Why should we focus on solutions approach while telling stories around COVID-19? It's because there's a lot of focus on what is wrong, on what is happening, what the government isn't doing right. There's a lot of focus on trying to get, while you're investigating, you're trying to get a certain information from a government official. They are frustrating you. They're hiding the facts that you need. And sometimes you can't finish your story. And sometimes when you read stories around COVID-19, you will see mostly stories that are reporting on probably low vaccine confidence, stories that are reporting on adverse events following immunization. And sometimes because some journalists do not understand this properly, they report it as, a certain vaccine has caused people to feel a certain way if they do not understand it properly. So it gives journalists the power to give the continent new perspectives to COVID-19 story. We're going to look at why these people did what they did, how they did it, if it worked or not. If it worked, how did it work? How did they make it work? If it didn't work, why did it not work? We report all of that when you're covering from the solutions. So many misinformation going on. People were looking for where to get proper information, the right information. At that point, I knew I needed to do something different. I had learned about solutions journalism 2 years ago, but then it was during the pandemic that I started practicing it properly. So who can practice solutions journalism? You and I. I'm a broadcast journalist who is really interested in amplifying small voices in hard to reach communities, amplifying their voices, their issues in order to drive traffic towards what they are going through. And sometimes I tell it from showing how probably a woman who wanted to give birth, but then she lacks proper access to healthcare or a primary healthcare center. I can share a story of how she was able to overcome that, how she did it in order to show what the problem is and how it can be solved, right? So how can we do this? How can we tell stories from the solution angle at this point? Let me start from sharing the experience I had while covering the pandemic during the lockdown. I told you, I mentioned this earlier, I was listening to a lot of people share their stories. I was having a conversation with a man who had volunteered to help the Public Health Emergency Operations Center in my state, in Imo State, Nigeria. And then he mentioned that, in his community, that people are actually putting heads together to make sure that nobody gets infected in their community. At that point, I knew it was a story to be told. How are these communities protecting their members from contracting COVID-19? So I had to tell that story. I went to the community, I spoke with the people. I even realized that they even had to put some members of their communities at their borders to check people who were coming in. This was not government efforts. These were individuals in their communities making efforts to ensure that their community members will not get infected by COVID. That is a solutions approach to that storytelling. So when you tell it, I told that story at a point when there was a lot of secrecy around what was going on with COVID-19 in my state. We did not know the plan of the government at that point. But if this community had a plan in their community, then that means the government ought to do better, right? So that is why solutions journalism is very important. I would also like to share that if you're looking for how to find some of these stories, you can check africacdc.org. I'm going to share the link in the chat box. You can check africacdc.org. They usually have sessions. They usually have sessions where there's a report on how countries are faring with COVID-19. So that works. When you look at how different countries are faring, you can find out what can be replicated in your own country, right? So if Kenya is using this approach.
Flip your screen to horizontal, Jidera.
Okay. Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. Is that okay? Is it showing properly?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So so you can check what this country is doing better than my country, how they are tackling the same issue that you're facing in your country. You can check for why certain countries in Africa are vaccinating more of their people than some other countries. Is there anything they are doing differently? Find what they are doing differently. Tell that story. I'm going to share. I thought I shared it, but if not, I'm still going to share that link. I'm going to find the link and share it. There's also our worldindata.org. This is where you can find the number of vaccines that number of people who have been vaccinated in different countries. So you can also compare and contrast. That would also be a way for you to tell a solutions story. I would also share this at some point. It's an idea I had telling a story of how journalists in different parts of Africa were coping with the pandemic, right? Journalists in Ghana, Kenya, Ghana, Nigeria, Uganda. I was going to look at how they were coping with it in their different countries. And it's important for us to pay attention to the people around us. From what the people around us are saying about the pandemic, about vaccine hesitancy, about vaccine confidence, can help you determine if there are stories to tell. I had a conversation with my colleague and we're talking about COVID-19 vaccine. And he shared with me how a friend of his, wanted to throw his wife out of the house, threatening to throw his wife out of the house because she got vaccinated without telling him and his family. And his wife is a health worker, right? So the moment he shared it, I knew that this is a story that could be told. How did this woman do it? How was she now able to convince? Was she able finally to convince her people that vaccines are important, right? So these are things that we can start looking out for. We can look at how people who are influencers, like our traditional rulers, our religious leaders, if they are doing something different to make their people protect themselves, tell those stories. When we amplify solutions, it can help other people know what they are doing well and what they are not doing well. It can help us know how they can also do better. And remember, solutions journalism does not sing praises of the people. It's important that it focuses on what was done. And while you're doing that, make sure you also speak to the right resource person. Check with the Ministry of Health in your country. It can also help you determine that you're speaking with the right people, especially concerning vaccines. So we owe it to our continent. We owe it to our continent to share stories, right? To share solution-based stories. 15 countries in Africa have hit the 10% COVID vaccination goal. This means that we have a lot more to still do as journalists. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jooste. And I want to also say we owe a lot to journalists like yourself, and certainly to a journalist like Peter Louis Myburgh, who's with Scorpio Daily Maverick. And in a sense, the story in South Africa feels to me sometimes like it's shifted from, talking about what wave you're in to where is digital vibes at. So I think very many of us on the call are curious to know how you found out all of that, and of course, what the interplay is between what it is that you found out and what the Special Investigative Unit is doing. So over to you, Peter Louis.
Hi, thanks, Ida. Good afternoon, everybody. So yeah, the digital vibes investigation really gives us a good sort of opportunity to walk through the investigative approach that we kind of typically would take in a public expenditure kind of setup. Just as a brief introductory note, I think it's worth noting that our methodology, as far as public monies goes, is really applicable to all kinds of government expenditure. So it's not necessarily limited to COVID-19 or health expenditure. We certainly have a public interest approach when it comes to public expenditure. It's not necessarily limited to particular fields, but of course, the COVID-19 era has caused us to do a bit of a pivot towards COVID-19 and general health expenditure last year, which is how we stumbled upon this contract. So I'll just quickly, briefly walk us through the digital vibes investigations, which we rolled out in February this year, following some earlier investigations, which started right here. Can everybody see my screen?
Yeah.
Great. So National Treasury started publishing these kind of reams and reams of data on various government entities' COVID-19 expenditure in around 2020, which became a fantastic tool, I think, for journalists to go and track government expenditure on all levels. It's quite a messy and sometimes not very user-friendly platform. It looks like this. But nonetheless, it does offer a pretty comprehensive summary or indication of where the largest bulk of government monies went throughout 2020 and even into 2021. So yeah, I think the Digital Vibes story, I think really is a bit of a enterprise approach. And I think it's important for journalists to understand that you don't have to go and sit, especially investigative journalists, you don't have to kind of passively sit around and wait for whistleblowers or sources to approach you. There is a newsroom-oriented enterprise approach that really allows you to become the forensic investigator and start delving into government expenditure before you get the tip-offs and information from sources and whistleblowers. So this really was a case of, we initially started looking at a bit of we did a data investigation last year, kind of tracking the monies and then comparing that to what the profiles of the companies were that were getting these large contracts. And we, through that process, were able to show that the most of the money was being deflected to really what was nothing more than fly-by-night entities who seem to have been set up quite shortly before, even after the COVID-19 pandemic broke. And in that process, the broader kind of data sifting, my eye fell on this name Digital Vibes while looking specifically at the National Department of Health. I think that department sidestepped a lot of the scrutiny because of the fact that the provincial departments were given most of the funds to choose how they would spend their own monies, and most of that money was funneled out to, especially for PPE and such goods, by the provincial departments. But at one point, after I dealt with the provincial expenditure, I moved to the national department, which certainly also spent quite a lot of money. I found this name Digital Vibes. It was, if I'm not mistaken, this data is a bit of a living, breathing animal. It is being adjusted as Treasury works through additional information being fed back to it. But it was at that point the single largest expenditure item at the National Department of Health. And my eye just fell on this company because it seemed quite a big amount of money for communications alone. At that point, it was 82 million Rand. And of course, it had since ballooned to 150 million Rand. So what would we typically do when we investigate a government contract like this? When I start getting interest in a company such as Digital Vibes. So you just like, it's probably worth noting that, you, after some time, combing through government expenditure, you do develop some sort of an instinct around these contracts and the names. And, something just certainly felt off here. The amount seemed out of line for communications work, and a brief initial kind of fact-finding desktop search on this company revealed that it was pretty much non-existent. That is your red flag number one. There are scores of companies in South Africa that work in the communication space that have a very visible footprint in that industry. They've got very nice offices in places like Sandton and Rosebank and the Cape Town CBD, etc. And as far as the footprint went, Digital Vibes was really, really just non-existent. So we would literally do a forensic investigation on this kind of company using tools and resources that are broadly speaking available to most South Africans and journalists. Some of them are not open source, so I do use some platforms that allows one to dig a little bit deeper. But you could certainly start with a pretty much a surface approach and look at Digital Vibes. When was it registered? Who are its directors, and what really is the company's background? And this process then led me to the first kind of major red flags that would eventually lead ones to the real scandals. So initially, red flag number one, you look at where the company is located. Its registered address is this residential street in Stanger in KwaZulu-Natal. So what I typically do is I go and have a look at where this company is located. And this particular address, I don't know if it looks to anybody like a thriving commercial enterprise. It certainly didn't look like that to me. Do you keep in mind that Google Street View is not necessarily always updated? These little vans from Google that go around snapping shots of streets, they obviously don't do that every year or every 6 months. So you just have to make sure that this is still the case. So we actually verified. I went out there and had a look at the property, and it's still very much a dilapidated building site falling apart. It actually looks worse than it looked on the Google Street View image. Other kind of things you can have a look at is what did Digital Vibes previously do? apart from, getting this big contract. So the Green Gazette is a nice platform to look at government expenditure and procurement records. I ran the company's name through the Green Gazette, and then came up with this contract awarded in 2018, which then represented red flag number 2, because Digital Vibes got the contract from the Department of Health when Zweli Mkhize was the minister, and then lo and behold, in 2018, when Zweli Mkhize was the Minister of Cooperative Governance, this obscure little company also got a contract there from Minister Mkhize's department. It was actually the Municipal Infrastructure Support Agent, or MISA. And I must be honest, when I found this tender bulletin information, I didn't even know what MISA is. It's kind of this obscure little entity that falls within the control and ambit of COCTA, of that department. And that is how I kind of drew another link, or at least a kind of very superficial link to Minister Mkhize, because it does have the appearance of the company gets contracts when Minister Mkhize is the political custodian, which certainly also does look a bit strange. Then what also is very helpful is tracking if there's any scrutiny or questions being asked about the expenditure, anything raised within the relevant oversight bodies. In this case, it was Parliament. So there were actually some questions being asked in Parliament. Oh, that's not mine. Are we done with the rock interlude? Okay, so in
it was a vibe.
That's the vibes, yes. So in 2020, these questions actually did start coming up, because they largely emanated or sprouted from the Auditor General, who had picked up that the procurement process itself was completely off. So when the Department of Health initially gave this contract to Digital Vibes, it was first a national health insurance communications projects, which then later evolved into a COVID-19 project after COVID-19 came about. But the Auditor General found that in 2019, even before there was a supposed need to sidestep normal procurement regulations and rules, pre-COVID-19, the Department of Health went and gave Digital Vibes this contract by a process that is completely dubious and curious. They totally deviated from standard procurement processes and had this very kind of narrow procurement bid process where they only invited select individual companies to submit tenders or pitches instead of going out into an open and competitive bid process. And because of that, the Auditor General flagged the contract as irregular. So these are the kind of red flags that would set us off, and then eventually lead us on to proving even more compelling information linking the powers that be with Minister Mkhize at that juncture. So we published this story in late February 2021, and the largest angle which really set off and got the ball rolling, apart from the previous red flags, was the fact that at that point in time, I'd also managed to make some inroads by way of, getting sources who were involved in this kind of broader process. So thankfully, it wasn't that tightly knit little community as far as the contract was involved. There was quite a couple of people within the Department of Health that were privy to what was going on there. And then also Digital Vibes had quite a couple of chefs in the kitchen, because they were also subcontracting a lot of the work. And it's quite this little community of people who were aware of the fact that there was this very pricey contract unfolding at the Department of Health. So I managed to link the previous red flags to the fact that the company had a director by the name of Radha Riram, on paper supposedly the boss of the company, but then I could establish that she really was just, by all appearances, a front for the company, and all the major instructions and so on for doing the work on this project were coming from these two individuals, Tahira Mathur and Nadira Mita, which then really was kind of the final and most compelling red flag at that point. because they are, anybody who's been, working within South African politics and in the media space over the last couple of years would know that especially Ms. Martha is practically soon to the hip of Minister Mkhize. She's walked with him politically since the 2000s. She ran his campaign for the ANC Nasrec elections in 2017 for his bid to become the ANC's president. And then also Nadira Mita, I could also trace back to Minister Mkhize's stint as Minister of Cogta, where she worked as his personal assistant. So at this point, then we could really say that, there's X amount of monies spent on this contract, and then the contract seems very much to be guided by or controlled by the guiding hands of Tahira Martha and Nadira Mita, despite the fact that the company's got other directors formally listed as its directors, which really does kind of raise suspicions about fronting and why these two individuals aren't listed as directors if they are the true controlling hands of the company. And from there on, it really became a snowball effect. And this is where the investigative journalist or journalists in general need to, just a kind of a practical note, your publication needs to have a very good process by which the public can reach you for lodging further information or providing with further information. You need to be easily approachable. And after a first story like this, our kind of tip-off lines do become flooded. It doesn't necessarily even have to be your publication's tip-off mechanism. Be approachable and visible in the social media space, for instance. And, keep your ear to the ground and watch out, because, sources typically do become more emboldened once they see a matter, being exposed for the first time. It's a very strange kind of psychology, actually. People are really afraid to be the first person to approach a journalist and be the kind of the original whistleblower. But once the horse has bolted and the story becomes an issue of the public record, then people seem to become more emboldened. Officials working at the department, other sources, and that certainly happened after we published this first story. There was quite a couple of streams of information coming in from different avenues. And yeah, that really got the ball going. So the links to Minister Mkhize then just gradually became more clear and more undeniable. We could prove that despite the fact that Digital Vibes has got this other director, Radha Hariram, listed as its formal boss, as far as company registrations are concerned, she really was not the guiding hand of the company, because she had been working at a fuel station back in KZN, while these two close associates of Minister Mkhize were actually running the day-to-day operations of the company back in Johannesburg, not from a dilapidated building site, but from an office they were then renting in Ilovo. And then just walk us through to the next one. This is just continuously, firming up the links to the minister. We were also able to find some. I'd begun to build a bit of a company profile on everybody who was working at the Digital Vibes Johannesburg office, especially, but also doing some work from them out in Durban. And it really just became clear that there were quite a couple of other people additional to these two original individuals who were closely linked to Mkhize and now also working for Digital Vibes. They included this gentleman, Ndum Tetwa, who's married to somebody who worked very closely with Mkhize when he was still at Luthuli House as the ANC's Treasurer General. And then another young lady who had worked for Mkhize's foundation back in Pietermaritzburg. Mkhize's hometown is Pietermaritzburg, was also now working for Digital Vibes. So it just became clearer and clearer that people who had previously been very close to Mkhize were now the individuals who were calling the shots on Digital Vibes, and then by all appearances really running the show. And now I was also looking back. I think it's always good to show the public what kind of a history a company like this has. So I'd previously mentioned that the company also got a tender from that COGTA agency, MISA, the Municipal Infrastructure Support Agent, back in 2018 when Minister Mkhize was the political head of that department. And I had in the interim started, and this is another very practical suggestion, Paya is your friend, use it. I know it's frustrating. I've got mixed feelings about Paya. It's hit and miss. And there's a whole separate debate we can, and probably a presentation we can have on what can be done to save Paya in South Africa. I think the mechanism is really falling apart because government officials are largely ignoring their legal requirements to adhere to that. But nevertheless, this one was actually successful. So I submitted a Paya request just for some information on how Digital Vibes got that contract, seeing as it just happened to be from Minister Mkhize's department, and the contract just happened to go to this company that was so closely linked to his associates or his aides. And then that process turned out to be very fruitful because I got the entire bid bundle for that earlier contract. And that allowed me to show the public what absolutely dodgy and dubious procurement techniques and approaches Digital Vibes uses to get these contracts. Their bid submission was made up of largely entirely fraudulent material. They claimed that they had done other government work in other spheres of government to firm up or bulk up their bid submission presentation. And then I approached some of these other government departments, and they said they'd never heard of Digital Vibes, they'd never done work with them. And there were also some profiles of individuals who were included in their bid submissions to firm up their staff component and people who were supposedly doing work for them. And I individually phoned some of these people, and I said they didn't do any work for Digital Vibes on this contract. So it really looked like they were employing some what appeared to be fraudulent means to obtain these other government contracts, or especially the earlier MISA one. And then, this one really kind of shook the foundations because I think at this point in time, South Africans were generally just very fed up with, seeing the blatant abuse of COVID-19 funds throughout 2020 into 2021. And here we could show that I had gotten actually I'd gotten through a source some invoice material from Digital Vibes for the first time. So previously we kind of had this global figure of what the company had been paid, which was 82 million Rand. But we now got this information showing it was 150 million Rand. And not only that, I could analyze the invoices to pinpoint exactly what the company had been billing the department for and what they were being paid for. And that included things like literally phoning the SABC and organizing Minister Mkhize to go on air to announce the second wave of COVID-19 infections, which is just a preposterous situation if you consider that the department has media personnel who anyway routinely do that as part of their jobs. Nobody should be paid externally for doing this kind of work, and not these eye-watering amounts. We're talking about millions of rands for essentially managing Minister Mkhize's schedule. Quickly trying to speed it up. And this is, I suppose, this is the watershed moments. This is where it comes full circle, because you've got the background of these dubious red flags and the connections to Tahera Mahfer. And I got lucky. At this point, I just might add that the SIU at this point had not been on the scene yet as far as really making inroads into the investigation. And as far as I know, they only really got going probably in around June, the following month. So I was still working off, I can't go into too much detail on the exact kind of like bundle of documents I was working from, but I had pretty good, substantial financial data on what Digital Vibes was getting paid and how they were spending some of the money, which kind of really allowed me to do a proper sort of follow the money analysis of where the money was going. And I got a breakthrough. It's a very small one. It's been ridiculed initially because of the comparatively small amount of money talking about here, but nevertheless, it's a link. I picked up a small expenditure of less than 7,000 Rand that went to a property maintenance or little construction firm in Bryanston in Johannesburg. And I also got an invoice for the property, and it contained Minister Mkhize's cell phone number, and also the property itself, that the address. I did a deed search on the property, and I established that the property was owned by Minister Mkhize's ZLM Trust. So the property belonged to him. Digital Vibes was paying money that was coming from his department for his own property's maintenance. Major no-no. And then we also found that I could pinpoint monies that was being paid to his son, Didani Mkhize. This is very direct. Just kind of shows you how brazen these kind of companies have become. They usually funnel a lot of the money through third-party entities, but there was money going directly from Digital Vibes to Minister Mkhize's property son. There was also money we could later show that went to a vehicle that was bought for Minister Mkhize's son, Didani Mkhize, a used truck. So the quantum was just kind of growing at this point. You know, as I was sifting through these records, you know, first we had the 6,000 Rand amount for the property maintenance, and kind of some members of the public scoffed at us, you know, it's such a negligible amount. And then it really kind of grew. You know, we had the vehicle bought for his son. There was millions of rands. It was getting bigger now, funneled to a nail salon and a hair salon owned by the minister's children, actually his son and his daughter-in-law, the Dani and Stockholm Mkhize. So the quantum was just kind of really growing at this point. And then finally, just the last one I'll quickly just touch on is the most recent one that again just really cements the notion, not even the notion, but it confirms that the Mkhize family really had a very real and significant financial stake in this contract. And this is, of course, the 1.88 million Rand, almost 2 million Rand, that went from Digital Vibes through a bunch of entities to pay off Zweli Mkhize's wife's loan for a farm from the Tala Development Agency. And I think I'll just quickly, what I'll do for this last story is just a little bit of a walk through what we do visually. I always tell you know, journalists that especially investigative journalism can become quite dense and text heavy. So it really is important to me and for us to have a nice set of visuals that eases the reading process and the digestibility of what can be quite complex money flows and financial information. So we generally kind of really like to break it down. This is where the money went. And then especially with the actual follow the money approach, you know, we would literally, you know, visually follow the money from the department. That's by date, as it works its way from the department to Digital Vibes, to Mateta projects. That's essentially a slush fund for the Mkhizes. Mateta forwards the money to Sarela Trading, and then Sarela Trading pays off Minister Mkhize's wife's farm loan, the bond on that farm, and also funnels money to the farming venture that is run by the Dani Mkhize. They kind of very clearly illustrate the flow of funds and how money laundering essentially actually works, involving all these various entities. And that is my brief dissertation of the Digital Vibes scandal. Thank you very much for listening. Welcome to take questions. Happy to take questions.
Great. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. I actually just have a burning question, and that is that, you know, all of this was, you know, came into our lives, Peter Louis, at the same time as the Zondo Commission of Inquiry into state capture also unfolding into our lives. So you talk about scale, of course, state capture is at a massive scale, but I still just can't, I feel like one would have thought that with such focus on corruption and such concern, you know, global concern about the degree of corruption, the level of corruption in South Africa, you would have thought that some of those procurement processes would have been tidied up, that it would not have been possible to do what you found had been done. So in that regard, I mean, is it just us journalists kind of having fun, finding out things, kind of going from moment to moment, and you know, talking about solutions? Where's the solution in this? Where is the sense that will end?
Yeah, certainly. Look, I absolutely agree with you. There's a real sense of disillusionment because the Zondo Commission, and not only the Zondo Commission, but I suppose the New Dawn movement that came about in late 2017. That was supposed to be a turnaround. And what we see out there in reality is that the absolute opposite has happened. Not the opposite, corruption hasn't gotten worse and it's not gotten better. It's stayed exactly the same. And it's absolutely at a very terrible point in time. The corruption in state-owned entities and state departments are more or less on the same level, despite the fact that we've had this very costly and very public process of supposedly dealing with it through the Zondo Commission. I always make a couple of very practical suggestions. So the corruption, at least this kind of corruption, happens in the procurement machinery, and there are ways of firming that up and making it much more difficult for people to get away with this looting. The process should be much more transparent. I'm proposing, it's not the most radical changes, but it's certainly implementable. The entire process needs to be transparent and should be open to the public from the get-go. We shouldn't learn about these entities getting these contracts after the fact. The public and those who want to analyze and scrutinize and go along with the process should be with the bid process from the moment it starts. So you should be able to log into some sort of a system and see that Digital Vibes, Company X, and Company X and 5 other companies all submitted bids. This is the bid value. This is the company registration number, so that you at that point already can have a look at who this entity is, who all of the bidders are, just to more proactively avoid a scandal like this. So there's definitely much to be done. It just remains to be seen if there's a political will to clean up the procurement machine.
Thank you. And let me ask the organizers, I want to be able to see if there are questions from the audience, which I would say we take now, but I'm not sure. And then secondly, if not, I would say we could go to Michael, who has prepared a roundup of some of the approaches mentioned here, resources to be shared, et cetera, So who can answer this question? Are there sort of typed out questions from the audience anywhere? No questions at the moment. Thank you. So I think let's go to you, Michael. Give us a roundup of where to find some of the resources that will help with all of the approaches we discussed today.
Thank you, Ida. Thank you very much, Ida. So I've prepared a few key resources that should go a long way to helping journalists from around the continent to tell deeper, richer, wider, more impactful stories about the pandemic and, of course, the vaccine rollout across the various countries on the continent. There's one link to write down or to remember where you can access all these resources. That link is on your screen right now, www.bit.ly/the-COVID-19 story, with a hyphen between COVID and 19. So bit.ly/the-COVID-19 story. If you click that link, you'll be able to see exactly what I'm seeing right now, this grid of resources. So there's about 6 or so on the page, short and sweet. And I'm just going to run through each of them now, and just to give an idea of what each of them entails. The first 2 are 2 online courses that launched this year from the Internews health team, called Let's Talk Vaccines and Let's Talk COVID-19. So to get to those courses, it's internews.org/Let's Talk Vaccines and internews.org/Let's Talk COVID-19. This is what the course looks like if you click through to access it. So it's a free course, and it's really meant to help journalists and other types of communicators or storytellers to really just make vaccine science more accessible, understandable to the public via good journalism. So it's really just to unpack important issues around the vaccine to aid effective storytelling. So these are kind of some of the objectives that you can expect to follow through with on the course. You can expect to gain a thorough understanding of vaccine science and history, access, logistics, and uptake. Adele Baleta, who's on this call, was one of the main authors of this course. And secondly, apart from vaccine science, history, access, logistics, and uptake, you as a journalist will also learn how to take that knowledge and convert it into great storytelling, compelling storytelling. And then we've also put together a really nice selection of sources and resources where you can find accurate, up-to-date data and other tools relating to the vaccines. So on this landing page, there's a preview here of the curriculum. So starting off with the introduction where you can just meet the team, and then moving into the vaccine science, and then access, and then the rest of the course. So once you've enrolled, which you can do by clicking on this orange Enroll Now button at the top of the page, once you've enrolled, you can instantly start taking the course. So in your own time, on a device of your choice. No need to come to the course at a set time. It's not. There's no schedule. It's at your own convenience, at your own time, at your own pace. So this is just the welcome page where it explains what the course is all about. And throughout the course, you'll notice these colored boxes which help to guide you through the content. So just to punctuate the content. So lots of exercises, lots of did you knows, lots of shortcuts or quick wins, low hanging fruits if you've got looming deadlines. External resources, words of caution, because none of this is always 100% all of the time. You know, sometimes we will have questions, and maybe sometimes there's no answers to those questions. Even the scientists don't yet know everything. So we make a point of pointing that out. You know, when there are gaps in the knowledge, and that needs to be communicated. So yeah, this is the course team. It's Adele, Jaya, Katerina, and Ida from Internews. They put together this wonderful course. So it starts off with the introduction to the vaccine science and the research.
Welcome.
We've put in a few videos now and then when we can, and you just progress through the course by going through the content for each lecture or topic, and then clicking on complete and continue at the top. So in the first module, you'll go through vaccine history, you'll go through immunity, population immunity, vaccine developments, vaccine types, and along the way there'll be lots of infographics and so forth, which should be loading on the screen right now. So we've tried to make this course as graphic and as visually appealing as possible. For example, for the different vaccine types on this topic, when you hover your mouse over the card, you'll be able to see how that particular vaccine type actually works for each of the main vaccine types. So that's pretty useful info for journalists who are perhaps not yet sure about the differences between the different vaccine types. And then vaccine monitoring. And after that, we move into vaccine access, which is really broken down into 3 pillars, and those are equity, governance, and human rights, all equally important components of the issue of access to vaccines. We then move into vaccine logistics, which is all about vaccination plans that various countries have.
We will want to see where.
There's another intro video from Adele. So just how vaccines get into a country and move around a country and are just distributed under the optimum conditions. Each country should have their own national deployment and vaccination plan. So we've got examples of what those would look like. And then we move on to module 4, which is vaccine confidence. Obviously, as journalists, we have a role and a responsibility to enhance or improve the confidence of our audiences in terms of being receptive to vaccines and vaccination. Obviously, we know that there are a lot of anti-vaxxers out there. There's a lot of misinformation floating around. And one of our main roles as journalists is to make sense of stuff, including vaccines. So we really try and communicate here clearly how you can communicate clearly to your audiences about why vaccination is so important, and how to dispel disinformation, misinformation, and why that stuff comes up in the first place, and how it exists sort of on a spectrum of hesitancy. So we try and shifting the language from vaccine hesitancy to vaccine confidence, so putting a positive spin on it. So getting quite deep into the the psychology behind vaccine hesitancy. It's a super important part of the whole bigger picture of vaccines. So there's a whole module on that. And then to finish off the course, there is a module on vaccine information sources and resources, including a lot about preprint research, how vaccine research is done and how it is distributed, and who you can rely on for research, where you should be looking for the latest, most reliable research. So how to search for information about COVID-19 vaccines. So, and then finally, some tips, practical tips on really just, telling the vaccine story, with lots of external resources here as well. So you can spend as much time or as little time as you'd like on this course. Obviously, the more time you spend on it, the more value it's going to have. And there's a wealth of useful information included in the course. The sister course to Let's Talk Vaccines is this one, Let's Talk COVID-19. And this is on a more fundamental level about the COVID-19 virus. Obviously, the vaccine story only emerged subsequent to the COVID-19 story. So sometimes we need to step back a bit and look at the bigger picture. This course is also, completely free and available 24/7, and it's on your own device, cell phone, tablet, laptop, up to you. And you can just enroll for free with this button over here. And this course is looking at COVID-19 more broadly and how you can tell, stories along the whole spectrum of the COVID-19 story, of which vaccination is just one part of the story, of course. So that goes into the nature of viruses, zoonosis, and the origins of COVID-19, the nature of the different variants that we are encountering, how COVID-19 is actually diagnosed and treated medically, how to look at and analyze and communicate about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and then how the data is constructed and used. So that's the second course. Let's Talk COVID-19, second course. So just a reminder, in case you didn't get that link, the link to all of these resources that I'm showing you now is www.bit.ly/the-COVID-19 story. That will take you to this page where you can click through to all the respective resources. The next one we're going to be looking at is called the Africa Data Hub. And this is a repository of data, COVID-19 data about Africa for Africa. And it is responsibly sourced data that is all about accurate reporting and ultimately an informed citizenry, which is obviously one of the end goals of journalism. So that resource is located at africadataHub.org, which looks like this. I'm hoping you can still see it nice and clearly. And that's really divided into sort of three sections. If we just go to the homepage of the Africa Data Hub, this is the blurb that I've just shown you. And then these are their main three sections. So they've got a section containing mapped data using a really nice tool called WASIMAP, an interactive data tool. Lets you visualize data on a map, always very helpful. And then they've got a vaccine tracker where you can find out which African countries are leading the race in terms of vaccine distribution, or see how your own country slots in. They've also got a very interesting resurgence map, which we'll actually look at a video about right now. And that shows you where we need to focus our attention in terms of countries where the resurgence rate is spiking. So where possibly a new variant has just started emerging, or infections are going up alarmingly. So that's obviously something we would need to pay attention to as journalists. So I'm going to play a quick video about that particular feature of the Africa Data Hub, and I'm hoping you'll be able to hear it. Here it is.
Welcome to the Africa Data Hub. We source verified data on COVID and related issues and package them in dashboards to help journalists tell powerful data stories about the pandemic. The data we use is updated daily and allows for real-time exploration and reporting on COVID, but also on other issues that may emerge as the pandemic progresses. In this short video, I'll take you through some of the functionality of our resurgence map. Let's dive in. The first thing we'll cover is the landing page, which shows a snapshot of the changes in new COVID-19 cases per million on the continent. The countries in red had an increase in cases this week compared to last week, while the countries in blue had a lower number of new COVID-19 cases than last week. Immediately, you can get a sense of countries that are on an upward trend. This side panel also lists those countries in more detail, with the biggest climbers at the top and those with the biggest decreases at the bottom. Importantly, this exclamation mark signals potential gaps in data, so take these values with a pinch of salt. Let's dig into this a bit more. So if I want to really understand what's happening in Cameroon, and if they really have had a sharp decrease in COVID numbers this week, I can either click on the map or on the sidebar, and I'll get taken to Cameroon's specific data. The number of new confirmed cases over time pops up, and I can use this time scroll button to zoom in on particular dates. I can immediately see the gaps in the data. This doesn't mean that there aren't new COVID cases in Cameroon, but rather that this information hasn't been shared by the national government. This starts providing us with good context to the data. The next thing I can do is overlay other indicators of interest. For example, how has Cameroon progressed with their vaccination program? We can use the vaccinations smoothed per million indicator. We've used statistics here to eliminate outliers from the data to show clear overall trends. In this case, the peak in vaccinations may have had a positive effect on the case numbers, but more investigation and contacting of expert sources is needed to confirm this. In some cases, this data is not available. For us, at the Africa Data Hub, we see this as an opportunity to interrogate why that data might not exist. Is something happening locally that means this data is not available? Our tools can provide some answers, but can also be used to uncover other questions and ultimately other types of stories. Check out our other free dashboards at africadatahub.org, and we'll be adding new resources in the future. You can also sign up to our...
Okay, going to cut it there. If you like what they do, sign up for their newsletter. So that's the Africa Data Hub, and that's their resurgence map tool, which is very handy for picking up on stories that are newly evolving related to sudden changes in infection rates in different countries. And an interesting point there made by the narrator that sometimes some data is not available, and that doesn't mean we should just accept that and stop there. Sometimes there's a very curious, compelling reason why that data is not available. So while the existence of data and looking into data might help us to tell certain stories, the non-existence or the absence of data might help us to tell even more powerful stories. Why is that data not available? Is it being intentionally withheld? And that's an almost bigger story to pursue. So yes, look for data, use data, but also be conscious and wary of when data is not present, and ask why, because there might be a story lurking there as well. Okay, back to the list of resources. Next up is a beautiful PDF guide, Reporting in a Pandemic guide, and this is produced by SANEF in collaboration with the Frey College as well as Internews. And that guide looks like this. So it's a PDF, so you can just download it or even print it out if you need to. It's 48 pages long. This is what it looks like. And I'll just quickly take you through the contents so you can see what it includes. So chapter 1 is all about a journalist's role in a pandemic, so getting quite existential there. Who are we as journalists in a pandemic, and what should we be doing and why? And issues of ethics as well. Chapter 2 goes into personal safety for journalists reporting during the pandemic. Chapter 3 is an important one that's often overlooked. It's all about mental health, which is a very serious consideration that should be acknowledged and dealt with and treated with equal attention as all the other components of working as a journalist in COVID-19. Chapter 4 is all about working agreements, so just about newsroom kind of logistics and interactions and operations. And then chapter 5 is the basics of health and science reporting, very useful. Chapter 6, all about vaccinations. So a lot of this information you'll also find in the course, but it's nice to also have it confirmed elsewhere. and just to rehash, or not rehash, but recap and confirm your learnings. Chapter 7, telling a greater range of stories, avoiding the lazy man's or lazy woman's journalism, which is journalism. Chapter 8, misinformation, can't be ignored. Chapter 9, stigma, and then all their references. So that's a really useful guide, nice and colorful and visual as well. So I'd recommend having a look at that, downloading it, keeping it on hand. That's a great resource from SANEF, as well as Frey College and Internews. Then lastly, just to bring your attention to the work that MediaHack is doing, mediahack.co.za. It all started off with their coronavirus dashboard, which was built specifically for South Africa, which looks like this. So all the data you could ever dream of or need or dream of needing is here for South Africa, but also other African countries, which I'll show you in a bit. So just data and charts relating to active cases or daily deaths, vaccination rates, trends of cases. So yeah, really a wealth of data here and charts relating to COVID data in South Africa, as well as other African countries. Pardon me. So to get to the data for the rest of the continent, one would need to go to this link at the top of the page here, Africa data. When you go to that link, this link, by the way, is the final link in this list of resources, COVID-19 in Africa. So if you click there, you're going to get to this. Now, from here, you can go through to the daily cases across Africa. There's a map of vaccinations throughout Africa. There is a list of other data resources and other data sets. So just quickly to show you some of these, if we click on COVID-19 daily confirmed cases in Africa, we'll see every single African country. We'll see what the chart is doing for that country. And this is updated on a daily basis. So last updated 9th of October. So it's really current. And at a glance here, you can quickly get an idea of where the spikes have occurred in various countries. So it would be helpful to look at your own country, so see your own country's chart in relation to other countries, and see if you can get some stories out of that. The next link on this list of COVID-19 in Africa resources from MediaHack is the vaccinations map, which looks like this. Let's give it a second to load up. There it is. So this is an interactive map where you can just click on your country of interest and see which vaccines are in use in those countries, how many vaccinations have been administered to date in those countries, and other kinds of data. So if we click on Egypt, for example, it should load us some information about Egypt. Otherwise, we can just go down through the list of countries below and get the data that we need for that particular country. So great work here done by the good people at MediaHack. So I would encourage you to explore their various dashboards and their various resources relating to COVID-19 and vaccinations throughout the African continent. So those are just a couple of key resources I wanted to share with you today, aimed at improving your storytelling. And there's that link once again, bit.ly/the COVID-19 story. Clicking on that link will get you to here, and from here you can navigate out to all of these respective resources. So yeah, that's it from me. Back to you, Ida.
Thanks a lot, Michael. Thanks so much. Of course, the approach that Peter Louis Myburgh presented for us here, enterprise journalism and following the money. I mean, there is a lot at the conference that is about that. I mean, as he mentioned, that's a really traditional area of investigative journalism. So I think very many of the sessions you'll see on the WOVA app and wherever else you're following the conference from has to do with that approach. And thank you so much, Peter Louis, for really showing us how you did it and actually showing us, actually helping some of us who've not done that before kind of, follow follow similar methods. I think our session time's almost up. I unfortunately can't see, oops, I should turn my camera on. Sorry about that. I think our session time's almost up, and I unfortunately can't see questions. I did want to just mention, talking about the various approaches that we presented here, about solutions journalism. There's a session specifically on that approach on Wednesday at 5:30 p.m. Central African time. That's Wednesday. And then on Friday, there's another COVID-related session. It is by Scoop Norway at Scoop Norway's masterclass on COVID-19. That's Friday at 9 o'clock Central African time. So yeah, thank you very much for tuning in. The COVID-19 story has many facets, from traditional journalism to really unraveling complex science, to really trying to report on those solutions that everyone's eager to hear more about and even contribute to. I hope you enjoyed the session. Thank you. Bye.